All right, theology nerds, this is Trip. And today, I'm getting to talk with my friend, Jeremy Fackenthal, a longtime friend. The volume of stories we gathered while doing our PhDs together in Los Angeles that we can't share on a live stream is significant. But there's still plenty of conversations we've had that are, we're probably going to show up here because we may both have been in Claremont doing some process philosophy fun, hanging out with a lot of the same professor and having sleepovers each week. But on top of that, Jeremy was putting the process philosophical tradition in conversation with Walter Benjamin, which means when you're in a PhD program, you talk about everything in your dissertation with your friends slightly inebriated.
It's true.
So today we're going to talk about it sober in the morning. So this is a whole new framework for us talking about Walter Benjamin, Jeremy.
We'll see how lucid I am in this state.
Yeah. During PhD program, you have like 3 seminars, a week while you're a student, and I would arrange where I have 2 one day and 1 the next day, and then stay over with Jeremy, so I didn't have to drive 2 hours over for 28 miles back and forth home, which meant, our metabolism was different at this point. There was a large volume of Domino's pizza and bourbon that occurred one night a week.
Yep.
Probably like half my week's calories at this point in one evening.
Right.
But during it, we talked about Walter Benjamin. Now, before we jump in and looking at his vision of history, the nature of the Messianic and such, I'd love for you to just share a bit about how, like at what point did you kind of interact with Benjamin's thought and go, oh, I would like to spend years of my life understanding this enough to write a book about it.
Yeah, there were kind of like 2 entry points for me. So a guy named Roland Faber was my professor and dissertation director at Claremont. And Faber had written like a short article in German, I think, about Benjamin and his conception of time, kind of bringing that into conversation with Whitehead. So I read that article like pretty early on in my time in grad school, and that sort of got me interested in who this guy was that I hadn't really heard of, who was well outside of process philosophical circles, but who was also thinking about time in a kind of different way than most traditional philosophers. And then I started taking some Jewish studies courses at Pomona College with a professor, Una Eisenstadt, who also ended up serving on my dissertation committee. And so she sort of introduced me a bit more into the Frankfurt School folks who were well connected to Benjamin. So I kind of came to Benjamin at that point, primarily through Adorno. So one of Benjamin's like longtime friends and colleagues. So that was sort of the way I got into him.
Well, for people that may not be familiar with the Frankfurt School, maybe you could say a bit about like what we would need to know, right, in order to spend some time thinking about the Messianic in history. And I know of late there's been a few references, especially in some of the conversations around Tillich, because Paul Tillich was Adorno's teacher. They had a lot of collaboration and such, especially on thinking about philosophy and culture and history and politics. But if people maybe only have heard boogeyman accounts on the internet and such, how would you describe kind of the agenda for the Frankfurt School and what they were trying to wrestle with at the towards the end of the 20th century?
Yeah, so the Frankfurt School was officially called the Institute for Social Research, and it was located at University of Frankfurt, headed by a guy named Max Horkheimer. So Adorno went to work with Horkheimer. They co-wrote a bunch of stuff together. The gist was to basically study social criticism or social theory and put sort of critical theory or a critical lens to looking at how societies come together, evolve, what the structure of society is, and then various questions related to that, like how language works in society, how literature, arts, music um, function within society, and then uh, it also took a political turn. So how does society structure itself politically? What's the role of democracy? This was a time when Germany had basically had a failed democratic system, and then devolved into national socialism in the 30s. Um,
They
so
should
those
have
questions.
just learned how to be Americans to have a high quality functioning democracy.
Oh yeah,
Doing it
yeah, no
right.
problems here. We're
Yeah,
solid.
and maybe one other thing that might help knowing where we're going is the Frankfurt School is inheriting the Marxist tradition, but in a particular way. And when we're thinking about history, and it, there's kind of an expansion of sorts in the Frankfurt School of the engine that's
Hmm.
moving history. Do you want to kind of do like a little contrast of kind of how they saw the inheriting the Marxist tradition and how it kind of reorients in the Frankfurt School?
Mm. Yeah, I think I can do that. So I mean, they were very much in line with Marxist and sort of social democratic materialist thought, um, and we're also heavily influenced by Hegel. Though Horkheimer, Adorno, other folks went on to sort of critique Hegel or give like Hegel a little bit of a twist. So Adorno later wrote a book called Negative Dialectic, where he sort of criticized the third movement in Hegel's dialectic. Um, but they were very much in line with sort of historical materialist thinking, which you know refused to say that there is this sort of sublation in toward an ultimate or a teleological sort of project, but kept the focus very clearly on the sort of material conditions in which people, all of life, was based and founded.
Hmm. Yeah, and one of the things, I mean, you mentioned this earlier, just how much time they spend reflecting on culture, art,
Hmm.
and also technology, and how the kind of emergence of, at that time, is the emergence of pop culture, the
Yeah.
emergence of a culture that is detached from the shared symbolic structure of Christendom, a political system where the incentive structures of the economy and individual nation states have a kind of a new dynamic where, like, the individual subject is different. Like, I remember
Hmm.
one of my favorite conversations with you, and it, you could say, Trip, I don't think any of them
This
ever
never
said
happened.
this. This is
Yeah.
just Trip's memory. Was and I believe it was Benjamin talking about how the the aura, right? Like,
Yeah.
that, say, like, when you this older period, this other previous historical moment, when, let's say, you were going to look at a painting, right?
Hmm.
A painting, one, it's a rare thing. There are only so many of them that are going to exist. For a long time, the art's going to be in the cathedral. Then maybe the aristocracy has it, and you do this painting, and the artist is trying to, in various forms of art, right, try to articulate the reality that's there, and then it's just kind of a painting. And after that point, like, the viewer uh, has to is becomes, like, actively engaged in attending to the painting, and it makes demands on the viewer. And there's always going to be a kind of a chasm of mystery between the painting and whatever the reality was that's there. This chasm of between, like, the artist and the reality, and then there's this whole experience of a mystery in beholding the art for any viewer. And he talks about it as, this aura,
Yeah.
and how that just gets deteriorated the moment you have film, or
Hmm.
and cameras, and then that gets deteriorated the moment you have cinema,
Yeah.
And in all these places, the act of creation comes something of capturing and controlling versus kind of beholding, and in the spaciousness, and it's that transition just of the technology of a picture, right? He's like, what's being flattened out of our reality? And I remember when we talked about that, I thought that it was such at least in our conversation, and who knows how I've repeated it to myself over years, I find that to be a powerful way of describing what often gets talked about as secularization, or the disenchantment of the world. So often we
Mm-hmm.
obsess with it like mechanical reasoning, scientific materialism, but there's also just this sense that how we attend and attune to the world under these different technologies start to flatten the very spaciousness that the fullness of humanity gets called into being by just beholding a piece of art.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. So there was an essay called "The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction," where he sort of lays all this out, and he's at first very critical of photography and then also film, because it can't convey that aura, he thinks, which is very much um, a quasi mystical connection that a person has with the piece of art. Um, I think toward the end of the essay, and likely more toward the end of his life, he saw a role for these new types of media. So for film and photography, for film in particular, but he also saw the dangers of it, and he wanted to be very clear about the dangers, um, because he, in the end of that essay, he talks about the fact that at that time anyway, or the time that the essay was published, which was in the early 1930s, film and photography had begun to be used as political propaganda. And so that flattening into that sort of secular space was also a political move. So it removed any of that sort of greater mystery and just made it possible to put out sort of mass reproductions of this sort of flattened version of reality, that he thought was, false.
Maybe that's the essay I'm thinking of that you were like, oh, you should read this, and this is where
Probably,
it's
yeah.
all flowing back. And in the two bits of just say film that I found really helpful, is uh, right, like when you're watching a film, if all of a sudden you saw a bigger picture, you would see that everything you're watching is actually a construct, right? There's lighting
Yeah,
and recording, and it's
yeah.
all edited. That what you're seeing is this reality that kind of envelops you in a theater, and you're brought into this universe is
Hmm.
is socially, politically, and culturally constructed. And then the other side of it is that that whole the entertainment industry has incentive structures and demands on it that are
Hmm.
going to limit what part of reality is ever going to be beheld of sorts in cinema, right?
Yeah,
So like even in starting to understand, right, this flattening sense of the aura, then there's also there's an ideological capture of art in modernity because of its market, the kind of the market incentives around it, along with which get expressed in those kind of
hmm,
propagandist narrative, right? So,
right.
a picture of a train in Germany, what's in it and where's it's
Hmm.
going. The propaganda depictions of, oh, Hitler is got success after success, and I mean um, even the way they played out, and this is something I started tracking down when we were working on the big Bonhoeffer series, is the way mass media in Germany covered people's attempted assassination attempts on him.
Mm,
Even the way they show and reflect them is creating him as a strong man,
yeah,
enacting God's sovereign providential will
yeah,
in Germany. And because the crowd and because the nation and all these things are a part of a narrative that's being constructed, then the viewer is receiving reality valuated on behalf of an ideology, and then you
right.
pretend that you get to have thoughts or wrestle with it or think about it democratically, and yet it's already Trojan horse of sorts, like that the medium itself contains the ideology, and then democracy lays a thing on top of it and goes, oh, well, pretend like you can have debates about the truth. Uh, but it's like bowling with bumpers,
Yeah.
the dead end of there are all these dead ends that are already bracketed, and here's the allowed outcomes.
Yeah.
Anyway, I had a dream about us talking about this last night, since I knew we were going to talk today.
Well, then we have to do it. There, I would also add that Benjamin had this weird fascination with pop culture, though, and so he didn't like want to totally denigrate pop culture. Um, and he had a whole sort of like second career, especially in the early 1930s in radio. So he produced like children's radio plays, and was very into like mystery stories and reproducing those for radio. So he saw some sort of like usefulness, at least as a, I mean, almost for Benjamin, it was more of like a pedagogical tool, or either that or purely entertainment. And so he saw that value, but at the same time, like you're exactly right, like he also saw the danger of what happens when like this sort of made for mass market story gets twisted, or yeah, gets shaped in certain ways that stifles conversation rather than encourages it.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, so the idea for this, and I try it one other time with Andrew Davis, where I'm like, this is a fun format of a podcast where I get to have sober versions of conversations with friends that I hung out with a lot during my PhD program, and we talked about Whitehead's philosophy. Now we're talking about history in the Messianic with Benjamin, and so I get my friends to give me 5 thesis statements that we've probably discussed multiple times, and sweet zinger quotes from the thinker, and then we'll just go through them and see what happens. But maybe before we go to the first one, I think the picture here on the slide is one that we probably talked about for 7 or 8 hours, and
Yeah.
and so if you could kind of help us understand, just as we're going to look at these kind of like 5 different theses that you want to discuss, Benjamin as a philosopher, like what is the question when he's starting to ask questions of history, and why why attend to a concept like the Messianic, and is as like a a central thread in his thought.
Yeah. Benjamin had a close friend named Gershom Scholem, who was a Jewish mystic. Scholem was like this, I don't know, nagging presence. He was sort of maybe like if you think of you and I and our relationship, you're way more churchy and Christian than I end up being at the end of the day. But you're good for me in that sense, and you keep pushing me to
how many
be better.
people say this about me, Jeremy?
So Scholem was that person for Benjamin, and Scholem like wanted Benjamin to go back and learn Hebrew. He'd been to like Hebrew school as a kid, or at least synagogue, but never really, like his family was mostly half Jewish, and so it wasn't a big part of his life. And Scholem just sort of kept pushing that, and also kept pushing this mystical side. So this picture of the angel is a painting by Paul Klee called Angelus Novus, which like commonly referred to as the angel of history. Benjamin owned the painting for a time, and then ended up sending it to Scholem, basically to get it out of Germany. And it's now, still in Israel in a museum. And for one of Benjamin's birthdays, Scholem wrote a poem about this angel of history and sent it to Benjamin. And it's this very sort of mystical discussion of the angel being like pushed backward in time, because the angel just sees all of the sort of wreckage of debris that keeps getting piled up in history. And so the angel became a sort of significant figure for Benjamin, and it was one of the ways that he finally started to write a bit more about the Messianic.
And now his mystical Jewish friend, probably not a Messianic Jew. Benjamin isn't either. And
Right.
so, a lot of times if people aren't aware of the history and the context, what's going on in the concept Messianic, so people don't mishear what you're going to be laying out.
Yeah. So the Messianic for Benjamin is not, it's not a person. It's not like a redeemer who comes to earth from beyond. It's simply the possibility for redemption. And what we'll get into is the way that Benjamin saw this redemption coming through memory or remembrance. So remembering the past um, was a way that the past could be redeemed. And Benjamin ultimately saw that this sort of form of messianism doesn't come from a specific person, but it can, in fact, come from people in general. So people can carry this sort of like weak messianic power within them.
And so the first kind of concept here is that for Benjamin, the messianic isn't a person or a character from history, but it is the fullness of history itself. Having some idea of exactly how this concept emerges in the history of Judaism, and then is being picked up in the context of like mass Jewish death, and then and wrestled with as the 20th century is both increasingly aware of the violent streak of humanity and our ability to level it up.
Yeah.
What, like, when you think of like messianic and hope and history, like what's uh why grab kind of that symbolic image from Jewish history?
Mm. Yeah, good question. I think Benjamin liked the way that Judaism it, biblically and historically was on the side of the oppressed. And and so the messianic for him coming from that sort of Jewish strain meant um, that you had to align yourself with the oppressed, and then it also then meant that you can't sort of pin the messianic as a messiah figure, because typically when we do that we get it wrong, and we end up picking the ruling class, or what Benjamin actually refers to in a couple places as the enemy. Um, he and while he totally pulled from Jewish strains of messianic thinking to do this, he also, there is a part in one of his last writings where he talks about the Antichrist, which is a weird. It's got to be the only place that Benjamin ever mentions that notion, and it's oddly Christian for someone who certainly was not. But in doing so, if you place it in its historical context in 1940, I think we can all figure out who he was referring to if there was a specific person in mind. Um, but there's this clear distinction between the oppressed and the ruling class. And he saw sort of the enemy, or who he refers to in this sense as the Antichrist, as a member of the ruling class. And so just his solidarity with the oppressed um, it meant that he had to think about the messianic and about redemption very differently, and in very careful terms.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the elements of it that, I mean, even comes out in this quote, right? Like, only the Messiah himself consummates all history, in the sense that he alone redeems, completes, creates its relation to the messianic.
Hmm.
In that, like, that the notion of the messianic functions as both a promissory note of history, right? Like that
Yeah.
history itself isn't finished, and
Hmm.
so you would never uh, identify the present or the past as its culmination,
Right.
which in some ways, right, like that anticipation of the messianic gives you permission to be honest about the violence, evil, and suffering of the world. And I know that, for Benjamin, and this is something we had quite a bit, quite a few conversations about. it was your insistence that we our temptation, both as Christians and as people with plenty of privilege in the modern world, is to take the violence of something like the Holocaust, Nagasaki, these kind of 20th century's eruptions of evil, and call them an exception of history, and that like where we are in the present, like those are exceptions of what's going on in modernity and history. Like we're things are getting better. We're
Yeah.
having progress, and that in that drive to like mute or minimize the ugliness of history is one where you're kind of like rendering to the present a kind of messianic transcendence, one that covers over the violence and suffering of history, and by making the messianic like structurally deferred in history, it both kind of demands that we judge the present in light of it, and
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
orient ourselves towards its coming, towards justice.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Whew, boy, I mean, this is where remembrance comes in. So he talks about, both he and Adorno refer to the idea of damaged life, and talk about the fact that we're sort of living in this realm of damaged life, because they're good historical materialists and they see, like, all the crap that just keeps getting piled and piled up. Um, it's also how he understands and where he brings in, that Paul Klee painting Angelus Novus. So it's this idea that the angel has its back to the future, so that like the angel's being pushed by the past toward the future, but the angel's not looking toward the future in any sort of like hopeful sense, or looking toward the future as the goal that it's trying to fly to. um, you could almost say that the angels tried to like hold back all of this like wreckage in the world that keeps piling up, um, and maybe like protect the future in a sense. Um, but Benjamin was very clear that there is no there is no teleology for us, or there's no, um, the telos is um, not the end.
Yeah, and part of that I think is that the sense that um, the one who can claim a single teleology for the world is now just also claimed a kind of sovereignty over
Yeah.
other people's lives, right? Like
Hmm.
it's not
Right.
personal; it's God's will.
Hmm.
Um, so so the next thesis I think really picks up here where you're talking about is that we have a weak
Yeah.
messianic power that allows us to redeem the past through remembering it. When you think of that notion of memory, history, suffering, what does it mean that as a symbolic species of sorts, we have a weak messianic power?
Yeah, I think it means, I mean, to go back to what you touched on earlier, that we're not sweeping the past under the rug. I mean, no matter how horrible the past has been, um, we can't just forget it and we can't let it go. Because if we do that, then there is no sense that the past can be redeemed. It's also, the idea of a weak messianic power is also like a slap in the face to any sort of overtly strong messianic power. So it's also not the case that we can just say, "Oh, like we've done our part, and now the past is redeemed, and we don't have to worry about it anymore." Um, it, and and it's not to say that those horrific things in the past, um, you can't endow them with some kind of greater meaning that makes them useful. So any time, or anybody who would say that those horrific events of the past, had some sort of higher purpose, that helped us then progress toward X, Y, or Z, Benjamin would say that that's patently false, and that you're pinning the messianic on the wrong Messiah. It, in this weak messianic power, he says that all of us are endowed with. Um, it also sort of spreads out the responsibility, and it's very communal in nature, in the sense that we as a human population have this responsibility to carry the past with us, um, to remember all of those horrific things that have happened, and that only by remembering them, and by continuing to tell those stories and tell them in important and helpful ways, can we say that the past has, any sense of redemption?
Hmm. When you think of I mean, even here in the quote, right? He says the past carries with it a temporal index by which it is referred to redemption. Like every generation that preceded us, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power to which the past has a claim. That claim cannot be settled cheaply.
Hmm.
It seems there that there is this contrast, I think, between time and history, or like temporality and meaning
Yeah.
in history. So in one sense, like the recognition of the messianic horizon, even in this weak form, trivializes or diminishes claims of sovereignty in the present, because it's going, no, you're located you're a part of this temporality, but history's meaning is something that's understood from its end. um and when that's the case, then you don't, you could just imagine saying this after someone just gave up, we're starting 1,000 year Reich, or
Right.
we're
Yeah.
something where now your own meaning and instantiation of sovereignty in the present is claiming both all the past for itself and the future.
Yeah.
And that erasure of the past and the horizon of the future it tends to collapse power into the present of the one,
Yeah.
and that both that communal sense, right? Like it's we have a weak messianic power, and the demand that the what we are inheriting, if we're honest about all that brought us to this moment, is something we can't just like cheaply seize and
Hmm.
own and direct. And I
Yeah.
think that uh, in a sense, there's this um, um, uh, uh, it it's it is a call to communal solidarity, and that solidarity is grounded in recognizing just what we inherit, right?
Mm. Hmm.
And so often our um community identities, especially in the present, it's even worse now, tends to cut us off from being a part of history. uh for example, like
Yeah.
um there's the temptation to pick the ideal point in the past of history and then claim it for the present, as if all that has transpired before and after that moment you're seizing it bears no weight. There's the which is probably more of a temptation for you and I, to look at the past, and then, like, as we start to acknowledge and recognize the kind of the vile suffering that's in it, we alienate ourselves from the fullness of our history, right?
Mm.
So,
Hmm.
take how many more progressive people go, okay, well, we have a stolen land, slave trade. It took forever for everyone even to be allowed to vote theoretically. Insert all that kind of stuff, and we cut ourselves off from the past because we've just completely rejected it. So there's even this
Hmm.
sense that you can cut yourself off from the past for good reasons, but then you're negating it as if
Yeah.
you aren't in some sense responsible for, like, not what is the utopia in the present, but how does that pass? If we're honest about the death that's there, what is the weak messianic form? Like, how do
Hmm.
we recognize the disasters and degradations of life that we're inheriting, but also, like, what are the dignities of existence that can be preserved or amplified or extended? um and one of the gifts, I think, of something like framing that challenge under the terms of the weak messianic is it gives you the potential to both be honest about the past and the fullness of its ugliness and injustice, and
Hmm.
that honesty's woven into a community that wants solidarity in the present, and a more just world in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. I mean, I think like the end of this quote like almost haunts me. Like that claim cannot be settled cheaply. And I
Hmm.
don't know what to do with this from a practical perspective. I don't know, you know, if there's like a practice that means that we're getting that much closer to redemption through this weak messianic power. But it's a responsibility that's always there. Yeah, and that has to be handled communally, and constantly.
Yeah, and I think the future we've managed in our own sense to not just alienate ourselves from the past in ways he raises, but I think we're also doing it to the future in even more intense ways. You know, oftentimes the time he's existing in is kind of critiquing the narrative of progressivism, right? Like,
Hmm.
oh well,
Yeah.
there's this telos to history, and we're a part of it, and you rah rah rah, and he's like,
Yeah.
oh no, basket. That's not really how this is work. Let's be
Hmm.
honest, what's here. Um, and it seems that as we become more and more aware of not so much our the coming golden age, but the apocalypse we're all running into, while
Yeah.
simultaneously feeling like we have no agency to avoid it,
Hmm.
we are alienating ourselves from the past, often in forms of repression because we don't know what to do with the guilt or the pain, and acknowledge what's there. But we're also doing something similar to the future, and
Hmm.
so there's this like deep alienation from history. If history is kind of like rendering temporality with meaning, even though we're like thoroughly temporalized in more atomistic ways
Yeah.
in the present, that makes the concept of the messianic here have like a potential new uses, as we're thinking about global crises that uh, help as we wake up to the
Yeah.
fact we're running towards the apocalypse.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we all keep saying, oh, maybe next year will be the year that we make progress on not hitting the goal that we've just already overrun of raising the global temperature by 1.5 degrees Celsius. Or maybe in 5 years we'll be better at producing renewable energy. Um, yeah, and there's this notion in Benjamin of homogeneous empty time, which is the sort of the version of time or the timeline that he critiques, and he talks about homogeneous empty time as sort of that, um, almost like atomistic notion of like there's one moment and then the next and then the next and then the next. And when you think about time in that very like physical separated sense, then it becomes easy to like colonize it. So like as you were talking about earlier, you can these sort of strong men can say, there's 1,000 year Reich because we've conquered or we've colonized all of time because time is this sort of physical sort of empty moment by moment understanding.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, right. And in that sense, like it's kind of a strong messianism, right? Where it's
yeah.
not just like
Hmm.
claiming uh, uh, the strong man is claiming the title of the messianic, and it is not a messianic secret. Um,
No. Yeah.
there's the New Testament joke of the episode. Um, so the next line, next little thesis thought here is that messianic time is the time of the now, a
Hmm.
time that contains the fullness of the past. Now, this is one of those lines uh, that at least in my memory of our conversations, I knew why he wanted to dialogue him and Whitehead, but also
Hmm.
I have the hardest time differentiating what he's doing right here and how I kind of just read things like a process person. So
Yeah,
what's
that's okay.
Benjamin doing, and what nugget of it got you going?
I think what he's doing actually is very close to like Bergson and then also to Whitehead. Um, there's no evidence that they were like familiar with each other at all, but I also read it in that way. So he's talking about this time of the now, or in German, it's Jetztzeit, which is this like very pregnant moment in which all of history sort of has its fullness, and you get this like larger snapshot of the past, and not just like individual little moments of the past, but the past in this like larger, fuller picture. I think it is very similar to Whitehead. So it's very similar to the idea that for each like concressing moment, the fullness of the past is available to be prehended, um, and either taken into that becoming moment or rejected from that becoming moment, but that you have that fullness of the past sort of ready and at hand. And he's making that sort of um, same argument. So he says like the notion of a present which is not a transition, but in which time stands still and has come to a stop. Benjamin also thought philosophically in terms of what he called constellations. So, if you think about the stars and just the way that the stars are arranged, we know that the Earth is rotating and that other bodies in space are also, orbiting things and moving around. You can tell that I have a very, very strong background in physics because I can explain this in a totally scientific manner. But what that means is that these constellations appear to be the same or in the same place, but if you look at the night sky over the course of a few hours, like you'll actually see movement, and you'll see things differently, or they'll rotate as the Earth is moving and rotating. And so a constellation for Benjamin was just a sort of like a snapshot or a moment where you could, you know, pause basically and look at the way that things were configured. And he loved to do this philosophically. So he loved to just have these little snapshots, these like intellectual constellations that he could sort of look at and work through, but with the full knowledge that in the next moment or the next day or whatever, that constellation might actually look a little bit different. So I think that's what he's bringing in here when he says that time stands still and has come to a stop. It's just that he can see, or we can see, sort of the fullness of the past in this present moment.
Mm-hmm. One of the things about this that um, that is helpful, and if I sound too much like a process person, feel free to talk me down. But
I
right,
would never.
so the like the notion of messianic time is when you put the phrase messianic in front of time, in some sense, it's making a normative claim of the potential for interpreting or receiving the moment any moment, right? Like, so,
Mm-hmm.
temporality is moving, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
and the past has a relationship to every now structurally, and which is part of him being a historical materialist, or anyone that's
Mm-hmm.
a process philosopher of any sort. That every moment of becoming, the past shows up, and so the
Mm-hmm.
question for uh, transformation is both, how does the past show up, and how do the possibilities available to that now relate to the past and the future. um,
Mm.
and so one of the things that I find really helpful, even as a Christian, in inserting like the notion of messianic time, is asking, it's kind of an invitation to ask yourself, like, um, how does the past show up if you're receiving it in a way that with a messianic orientation, right? And and
Mm-hmm.
and and I don't think this isn't strikingly dissimilar to say, like, the Philippians to him, right? Like, let the same mind be in y'all, the
Yeah.
church. Like, if we have a canonic mind, let the same mind be in us that was in Christ Jesus, who didn't count equality with God something to be grasped, but humbled himself, taking the form of a servant, even the death on a cross, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so there, it's just like the past is showing up. But how is it showing up? What How are you orienting towards it? How do you evaluate the past? Are you repressing it? Are you privileging other parts? Are you
Mm-hmm.
silencing elements? Are you flattening the web of relations? Are you seeking to understand in order to control, or and determine, or lead to flourishing and recognition? Like, there are all these ways that to go, like, the time, that messianic time is what happens in the now, where history is both present and invited into a kind of transformation, right? And so he goes, the
Mm-hmm.
fullness of the past, right? Think of how much of the past it's left off in our accounts in order to claim the present. But what
Mm-hmm.
happens when it all
Yeah.
comes? And one of the things I love about that, that's a regular conversation in kind of process relational philosophy, is that, yes, they, we're physically prehending the past, would be our, the Whitehead word, but all the past shows up, um, but the possibilities of whatever we contribute as an entity in the next moment, um, it can be more or less resonant, right, with justice or beauty or
Yeah.
goodness
Mm-hmm.
or adventure and zest. Um, and and for him, the rejection of kind of a flattened account of history is a beginning place for it. And I just think that as people of faith, both I mean any of the monotheistic ones, um, obviously God's identity's always been woven in our relationship to history. But when we make God's relationship to history one of sovereignty and providence, then it doesn't become part of our vocation as the people of God. And
Hmm.
the Jewish people, I think, have always insisted on that for, plenty of historical reasons in ways the empires of Christianity and Islam haven't always tended to it.
Yeah.
And so that notion of the past showing up in a messianic way is a way of thinking about the gift of possibility to a moment. And those possibilities towards flourishing, justice, and beauty and things are actually enhanced by honesty and wrestling with the past. That part of the
Yeah.
dignity of possibility given to us in any now is the dignity we get to give the past in its
Hmm.
brutal ugliness and also those eruptions of joy and justice.
Yeah.
Um, and I just think that's like badass. So,
Yeah.
it gets me pumped, which, if we were late in the night and bourbon had occurred, I would start preaching. This is what would happen right now.
Right.
And then
Yep.
Jerry would be like, "Oh, I feel Christian again." Um,
There'd be an altar call at the end for
yeah,
sure. Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's out of line with Benjamin at all. I think I mean, I also read him very much in those process terms, and I do that because he writes. So a lot of this comes from a writing that he sort of left behind when he died in 1940, called Theses on the Philosophy of History. So it was just a series of short paragraphs, um, not very long in total, where he laid out a lot of this idea of redemption through remembrance, the Messianic, Jetztzeit, all of that. And there's a moment where he talks about the sort of Jetztzeit, or the time of the now, being shot through with chips of the Messianic, um, meaning that it's like this very pregnant moment where the Messianic is permeating it and could just explode into something new. So he's very much open to those like novel possibilities erupting out of this now time, or the time of the now. And at the very end of the theses, like the last line, which is potentially the last line of text that he ever wrote. If he wrote this chronologically, we don't really know. Um, was that every moment of the future, or every future moment, is that straight gate through which the Messiah might enter, which I think is also very much clinging to his Jewish roots and to his relationship with Sholem and Jewish messianism. So it's the idea that, like, we never know, and um, but every second of every day there is that possibility, that very pregnant possibility that the Messiah might enter.
yeah. Which in many ways is saying like um, that there is the us as a collective in our life together could be the gate in which the Messiah enters,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
not in some final, complete sense, not as a result that is the logic of history expressed, but in that sense of like a giftedness to existence.
Exactly.
And I
Yeah.
think that I mean you can see why this work resonates deeply with like in why someone like Caputo picks it up
Hmm. Yeah.
in like weakness of God and such,
Hmm.
because they're it it's it's like coming at the nature of messianic hope, where the Messiah isn't the logic of history, um, and
Hmm.
and yet palpably present in history in this like deeply participatory way. But it's participatory in the sense that it is remembering the violence of history by remembering the messianic in the you'd have to put a dash. between
Yeah.
re and membering, um, but a holy bricolage of sorts.
Right.
Um, all right, so here's a fun one. 4. The Messianic isn't the goal of history achieved through progress, but the end of history. Um, help us understand here how that his notion of Messianic and how it problematizes history, progress, um, and its end.
Yeah. So I mean, he's flat out rejecting Hegel's understanding of the movement of time as this natural progression toward better, greater things. Um, and that's very much in line with Frankfurt School and historical materialist writings up until that time. And so he's saying that there isn't we're we're not moving toward the end of history or the goal of history through this progress, but that the messianic really is the end of history in the sense that it sort of collapses time. Um, so not that there's a moment in which everything is done and finished, um, but that the end of history it just sort of condenses. So it is when the past, present, and future sort of come together or meet in this very pregnant moment um, of some sort of new possibility
Mhm.
that can't be brought about by just technological progress, etc.
Yeah, and so in the quote you sent, he says, "The kingdom of God is not the telos of the historical dynamic. It cannot be set as a goal. From the standpoint of history, it's not the goal, but the end."
Hmm.
Um, underneath that, I think there is, it's a protest to something that you kind of wish more Christians protested against, right?
Hmm.
So when people hear the phrase "the kingdom of God," I'm going to guess 3/4 of the time people ever hear it is when they're doing the Lord's Prayer, right? And in it, the prayer, there's the kingdom of God come on earth as it is in heaven, right? And
Yeah.
so the line itself is rather clear that, like, earth, history, our material reality is where the problem is. And the hubris of modernity, especially in the kind of naive reading of Hegel, or maybe it's the accurate one. But, some of us try to help him out a bit. But at least for a large portion of the Enlightenment, the kingdom of God is the set destination um, for history. Or
Hmm.
you think of the in this, he's obviously writing before this. Think of the exuberance of democracies, nation states, and capitalism after the Cold War. We've got to the end
Hmm.
of history. We figured out how to run everything, and now let's bring in the neoliberal order and pass NAFTA, because who would ever think the working class would cultivate resentment when their agency is no longer seen in the political structure and vote for vile people? Um, you get to this point where, like, oh, now we're just fine tuning reality because we've got to the goal.
Hmm.
Underneath what he's saying there is, like, it's both an insistence that the promise is bigger than you can give birth to,
Yeah.
and a sense that what shows up inviting us to engage and enact itself in the present isn't something you'll ever end up possessing. And when modernity has related to history, reality, and really kind of like, Whitehead's line is like a bifurcated nature. Let us only attend to the parts that we can understand empirically, and then manage and control nature, reality. Let's turn humans into resources,
Hmm.
nature into natural resources. Let's make this demand for growth and acceleration a necessary part of life and flourishing, because it's just getting faster and going and moving along towards this epic goodness. And we'll just call it God. That way we never have to question it, be suspicious or critical of it, right? Like, here, I think that's the protest he's giving is one that resonates deeply with both, like, the messianic prophetic energy of the Jewish tradition, the very piety, right, Jesus passes on to his disciples,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
and Christianity on a good day. Thinking of him as a regular interlocutor with Tillich, like, this is the Protestant principle in Tillich, right? That
Yeah.
and that and what happens when you forget the Protestant principle or this kind of weak messianism is you confuse what you control from what you inherit as the divine.
Yeah.
And Tillich's like, it's called idolatry. And just because I'd spent a lot of time reading Tillich recently, when preparing for this, I realized just how that's there, and how even reading it in a straightforward way, often without the enlightenment background and things, people might miss
Hmm.
the synergy between
Hmm.
Benjamin's thought and the more prophetic edge of the Christian tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Benjamin would say, like, if you think that you're helping in the project of moving us toward the kingdom of God, then you better check yourself and make sure that you're not actually a part of the ruling class and fighting against the oppressed or becoming the oppressor of the oppressed. Um, so that's definitely on his mind. I also keep thinking about this in terms of like very, very present day arguments that are made on the far right. So the idea that um, we've progressed past democracy, and what we really need now, in fact, is a dictatorship or some sort of like governmental CEO who can come in and make the decisions for us.
Yeah, I would like to doge that.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, it to me, that comes to mind because it's this notion that, like, oh, the business world has progressed to such a place where, like, those sort of um, marketplace efficiencies are just clearly the way that things should be run. Um, and it's this notion that making decisions for the good of the market is somehow in place of or beyond or superior to making decisions for the good of working people or the oppressed.
Hmm. Do you think part of it is the it seems that there are like a series of successes in modernity that cumulatively set up uh, a kind of really dumb hermeneutic for thinking about existence, right? So there's like there are huge successes that come with modern science.
Hmm.
Um, but if what we get at scientifically is the totality of reality, we've abridged the book of nature and no longer have decent answers to basic human questions, right? And it, I think it was Adorno that talks about uh, that human beings carry with them the questions of human dignity, and it shows up in different cultures and then different
Hmm.
art and things. It all shows up. Tillich will talk about the way in which, like, the image of God is that we exist as addressed, right? And there are these kind of perennial human questions and these kinds of things. But like when you get the success of science, now only part of reality is what you can get at it. Or we get the success of nation states, and now we understand how humans are supposed to be, and we got this subject. We got the success of extending people moving beyond basic poverty, and now we make like capitalism the final regime of
Yeah.
of relationship of labor and
Hmm.
production and these kinds of things. Like we have, it's like this success happens, and then you make it ultimate. And I feel like that that kind of pattern sets up for a lot of the problems that you're facing, where all of a sudden existence, ethics, being human is an engineering problem, right? It's
Hmm.
the neoliberalism was like, well, great, we've got this all figured out, like where's the data? And they imagine as if they'll say things like it's just the data, or I follow the data, as if
Hmm.
follow is let me have my a priori narrative projected upon this as if I'm not putting it in the narrative of meaning. And
Right.
just the data is the most reductio ad absurdum phrase anyone can manage. But both
Hmm.
of them are somehow like inerrant phrases to legitimate a death dealing system. And yet, and I think like part of what the challenge of wrestling with this is the there's this temptation either to adopt it completely, these series of successes that legitimate this triumph story, and now just like Peter Thiel, like who needs democracy and capitalism? They're not compatible.
Yeah.
You know which one he's pulling for? The
Yep.
guy who funded our vice president.
Hmm.
Anyway, uh, that that uh, there's this one symphony series of success is set up, treating all these things that are important, ethics, existence, as engineering problems. And part of what I think is going on in in Benjamin is an insistence that the fullness of humanity in its history and the fullness of humanity in the present is
Yeah.
required for dignity and and
Right.
and when it's just the data, or this kind of logic, if it's an engineering problem, then you've removed from the all the things you're attending to, the very values that ground us in this, the larger task of being human, and its dignity and in community and such.
Yeah.
um yeah, sorry for, you made a reference to our techno overlords and a gummy.
Yep.
A little feisty, but
No, that's good.
I think it does set up for the last one here, and
Yeah.
is that the fullness of time, or the Messianic, gives us a revolutionary chance in the fight for the oppressed. The payoff of sorts for his vision, which is requiring a kind of honesty about the past, a rejection of naivete about the present, is really that weak messianism is a truly revolutionary perspective.
hmm Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, he thought that time of the now, or the Jetztzeit, this sort of very pregnant moment in which the fullness of the past occurs, that he says is shot through with chips of the Messianic. That's the moment where revolution can occur. And he's always, there's this big gray area in terms of what he means by revolution. Um, so I don't necessarily read Benjamin to say that this is, you know, some sort of a violent uprising by the working class against the oppressors. Um, but it's just this moment, or this possibility that things can be radically different, um, and that we can sort of flip things around such that the ruling class is no longer in their position, and the oppressed are no longer oppressed, or sort of a rewriting of history, and a laying out some sort of new order that's possible.
Hmm. All right, I want to read this quote, and then you can
Mm-hmm.
spend some time unpacking it, because he uses language in ways, if you're new to him, it's not going to be immediately obvious. And then when I think people get an idea what's going on, you can see why it's been what he's meaning here by messianic time is
Mm-hmm.
opening up a revolutionary chance. He says, where thinking suddenly stops in a configuration pregnant with tensions, it gives that configuration a shock by which it crystallizes into a monad. A historical materialist approaches a historical subject only where he encounters it as a monad. In this structure, he recognizes the sign of a messianic cessation of happening, or, put differently, a revolutionary chance in the fight for the oppressed past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot happening here, like philosophically. So the monad is this term that goes all the way back to a philosopher named Leibniz, who thought of almost of atoms, or of things that he called monads, that were this sort of collective, or this whole, that got solidified so that you could just look at it and sort of examine it. Um, Later philosophers, including Whitehead, picked up on this notion of the monad in a sense, but Whitehead said it's like a monad with windows, or he wanted to open it up so that it wasn't, you know, wasn't for Whitehead. It's never totally solidified into a crystallized moment, and I tend to think of Benjamin as doing the same thing. So going back to that idea of the constellation, he wants to have these snapshots. Um, And so he wants to look at things in this like stillness, or in this like snapshot of a moment. And so I think that's what he's referring to as the monad. And what's important for him is that if you can crystallize it into a monad through this like configuration, or a shock, um, then you can sort of see the possibilities that emerge from what you're looking at. or you get a clearer picture, and you can get a better sense of where the novelty or the revolutionary chance might enter in.
Hmm. And do you think, part of that, and part of one element, right, is stuff we've talked about already, just in the sense that um, domination systems tend to narrate the past with large amounts of it muted or edited out, and then the lived reality of many in the present, um, rejected, denied. I mean, even
Hmm.
people treated as non-persons in the account of reality, and
Hmm.
so like in some sense, this uh, the the shock of a monad and approaching change by there is, what happens when a a deeply thick and full account of any moment is the place of analysis for thinking of change, um, in contrast to kind of a revolutionary change that is the exchanging of one ideology for the other.
Mm.
Right,
Right.
and a lot of this is responding
Yeah.
to critiques of Marx, where it's like, "Oh, well, the oppressor and the oppressed, you have a revolution and they exchange relations."
Hmm.
Right, whether or not that's the most wonderful, critique of him, at this period of time, especially, um, I in the middle of the 20th century, that was a big happening, in the kind of the dismissing of critical theory in general in a lot of the West, one that's,
Hmm.
obviously increased in the second half of the 20th century, and so, part of what he's doing is going like, "No, no, no, it's not like, let's just reorient the ship,
Right.
and the
Yeah.
places of power so that the bottom are now on top and you keep the power dynamic. It's, let's look at the whole web of relations, the
Hmm.
structure of power and life and flourishing, what's being inherited, whose horizons have more potential in it and which ones are being muted. And if we can give a thick account of reality as best we can as it really is, then you actually have the chance of revolutionary change."
Hmm.
Um, and I think one of the reasons, uh, in thinking back through the Frankfurt School in general, and thinking of our conversations leading up to this, uh, why that's helpful, is the desire for quick solutions in our contemporary context, um, to individual crises, it leads us to give solutions that are addressing, like, substantial problems, like little problems. They're, "Oh, okay,
Yeah.
we're gonna address this one problem here, this one problem here."
Hmm.
And I think what Benjamin's describing here, are what process relational people in general go like, "No, the problem aren't the individual things, it's actually the whole web of relations that generate them. And if you isolate one problem and go, 'Let's go fix this. Let's have a revolution around,' insert your thing, you aren't going to change the relational dynamic that generates the problems itself."
Yeah. That's exactly what where I kind of wanted to go with this. I think that historically and contextually, what Benjamin was going through when he wrote this is very much analogous to what we're dealing with right now. So, he wrote this in 1940. He'd been living in Paris when Paris was taken over by the Nazis in, what, I think, 39. He was put in a work camp, like rounded up with a group of other Jews and sent out to the countryside in France and forced to do manual labor. It almost killed him just because of the physical nature of it, and also the mental turmoil that I think it put him through. Eventually, they sent everybody back to Paris and shut down the work camp. And it was at that point that he'd met Hannah Arendt and become like very good friends with her. She was a writer, journalist, German philosopher, interesting like student of Heidegger, who would later become a pretty famous thinker, writer, journalist in the U.S. And so they decided to escape. And so you know either when he's writing this or just after he's writing this, he's actually going through the process of getting out of Nazi occupied France and trying to eventually make it over to Portugal, where he has passage on a ship to the US to meet Adorno and a group of friends in New York. Um, he doesn't make it, but that's sort of what's present in his mind. So he's dealing with all of the, like, not just the larger horror of National Socialism and the Nazi regime, but all these individual little things that just kind of keep piling up. And I think for him, this response was to, if you can crystallize it into a monad and see this whole, then you've got a better chance at the revolutionary possibility emerging. Was because it was a chaotic environment where you're trying to deal with all these little micro problems, just like you were saying, which are important and significant, but just dealing with the little micro problems is not going to fix the whole. And so he wanted this bigger snapshot, so that you could see things in their entirety and come up with a better response. And I think that's very much analogous to where we are, where every day feels so chaotic because there are 10 decisions or orders being made, or people getting fired from government jobs, that you just can't. It feels so chaotic you can't see the bigger picture and know how this sort of revolutionary change momentum might actually occur in the best way possible.
Hmm. Yeah, thinking about that biographical bit of him being in Germany, at that time is that's the place where Jacques Ellul gets radicalized as well, and makes very similar observations um, about about history and the limits of an orthodox Marxianism, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and and both of them being in France, which is technically an ally, while you're being bombed by the Allies and under the oppression
Yeah.
of the Nazis, uh, is uh, you know is quite the feature, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
um, and 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 I wonder if there's a connection. You've read more of the Frankfurt School's stuff on technology, but Ellul talks about how the kind of materialist analysis of Marx is helpful, and it's strikingly revelatory for his own age, but in much like Adorno and Benjamin's work on history, like that analysis has to be done again about the
Mm-hmm.
different relationships of material reality and energy in any present.
Mm-hmm.
And the for Ellul, that sitting there in France being bombed by the Allies under Nazi occupation, he's like, there's been a migration of the substructure of sorts from capital to technique, which
Mm-hmm.
is for him, it's the drive of technological innovation, um, and uh, and the demands it puts on human beings, on nature, on the economy, the way in which it uh, the way in which it renders existence oriented towards a particular a particular drive, and I find that like a lot of times part of the logic of modernity that would both go, oh, the Auschwitz and Hiroshima are exceptions to modernity. Oh, that all this technology gets used for war or for propaganda or for insert all the things we find problematic on the present.
Mm-hmm.
If you're just trying to deal with propaganda or, oh, we use this energy source this poor way or whatever, um, both Benjamin and Ellul kind of like want this bigger analysis to go, do you do you really think that the problem is that you could use it to blow something up, or that the blowing
Right.
something up is precisely why we have it,
Yeah.
and there's occasionally positive uses on the other side?
Right.
Um, and Ellul raises that, war and propaganda are the engine of technique, the
Mm-hmm.
engine of modernity,
Mm-hmm.
and knowing how both of those things show up in Benjamin and the other Frankfurt School. I mean, do you see a connection between the two, um, or is there a particular?
Yeah, I
right
think
there?
so. Like what comes to mind actually when you say that is film and the arts. So the German film studios in the 1920s and 1930s were like a huge hit. I mean, they produced fantastic directors and great silent films, and then moved into like the talkie age, and were producing great films. And um, the studios were not like shuttered during the war, but they were in fact like bolstered and built up because Hitler saw the way that they could be used so easily for propaganda. And so like you could make this case that the arts and film through the 1940s, and in fact the same thing happened in the US, actually flourished because of the propaganda industry. Um, so yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
There's
I
a
oh, go ahead.
uh, there's a Netflix documentary series called Five Came Back, I think is the name of it. But it talks about five directors, and John Ford was one of them, from the U.S. who, in World War II, were either conscripted into or volunteered to go into military service, and they ended up producing films for the U.S. government. You know, we can make the case that our propaganda films were good, but they were still propaganda. Um, uh, and then they came back to continue to direct and produce phenomenal films, but you their careers were almost bolstered because of that use, and so and their lives were saved because of it as well. So yeah, the government, or whatever sort of drive that there is toward those more clandestine goals, yeah, occasionally has good consequences.
Yeah, the um, uh, Elon Musk talking about how we need to update the military by creating a Top Gun where overweight drone pilots from a military base in America get laid. It's just like saying the quiet part out
Wow.
loud.
Yeah. Yep.
When after the Luigi murders the healthcare exec, and his response on it is just like, well, it's not personal. He has a fiduciary obligation to the shareholders, and you're
Oh
just like,
God.
you you're saying the quiet part out loud, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm just hoping that on the train wreck we're going to have generates class solidarity in ways we didn't know, just
Right.
because Tweedledee and Tweedledum are telling everyone how it works. Um, but 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 I think you're getting at something that's important there, right? Like, technology, in some sense, is the discourse of modernity, but
Hmm.
technique and the way Alul uses it,
Hmm.
it is the power.
Yeah.
Um, and when we've created a world where we idolize things like efficiency, or security or control, it ultimately justifies a form of life that, in many ways, makes modern life uh, um, in a slavery to an idol, right? And so if you think of like
Mm-hmm.
idols, like people end up worshiping idols because they promise power and they want power. And then,
Yep.
and yet idols are not like these benign things. They're constructed by both our minds, like symbolically, and our hands. It's a discourse that it has a linguistic discourse that connects materiality and mentality.
Mm-hmm.
And when technique, or this kind of like the modern drive of control that gets expressed in our technology, and is the source of power, then we do with it what idols have always demanded. We make sacrifices, right? You get seduced by an idol, then you get crushed by it, you get transformed by it, and you give an allegiance to it because we want what it promises.
Right.
And um, and it then creates the very reality that all the discourse and reflection on it takes place, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so it's not till an idol's revealed as such, something else is there, something else is possible. And that's what I think is so promising about this messianic sense of the now, is you need a rich account, a full account of the present.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you just have idol worshipers, or organizing their best hot takes about doctrines everyone assents to.
Yeah,
Um, and
exactly.
you know, I would have appreciated at least one presidential candidate that didn't do that. But
Hmm.
you know, that was the past. Now we got the Messianic moment now. Um,
Right.
can't wait. Can't wait. All right. So one last question is, you mentioned the both Benjamin, his friend, Jewish, this context and taking place like during the Holocaust, during World War II. How does the kind of weak messianic picture of history and his thought at large kind of change the way we could think about that the notion of memory, history, hope, uh, in more like traditional theological context, right?
Hmm.
Because obviously there's a whole theology after Auschwitz a conversation, but this kind of deeply realist Jewish kind of prophetic energy, like what does it contribute to that kind of the larger kind of theology after Auschwitz conversation?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, developing a theology of remembrance that doesn't want to skirt over or around these sort of horrible moments in our own past uh, is not only important, but is like vital to then helping to ensure that the future is more hopeful and that those things don't occur again. Because I think if we can't necessarily be responsible on a personal level for everything that happened before us that we are privileged by or that we've even contributed to, but we can be personally responsible for how we remember that past and the decisions that we make going forward based on the memory of that past. So I think, it opens up for us those sort of, call them revolutionary possibilities, call them just novel possibilities. It opens up ways for looking at the past, examining the past, and then making different decisions in the present, so that we can build a more hopeful future. And I think for Benjamin, and I would say maybe for me as well, that's what hope looks like. Hope is this sort of like nascent possibility um, that if we're critical of ourselves, if and critical of the way that we look at, examine, and move forward from the past, then we may have a more hopeful future.
Hmm. Awesome. Well, this has been a lot of fun, Jeremy, and
Yeah.
uh, we do have. I wasn't paying attention to the chat thing, but uh, Herman wants to know what would you recommend one read of Benjamin's work in with regard to messianic time.
Hmm. Um, I would read. There's a book by philosopher Michael Loewy called Fire Alarm, and in it, Loewy basically goes through each of Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history and unpacks them. Loewy's also done a lot of work in Latin America, and so he has that sort of liberation context in mind when he writes about it. And so for me, it's just a really helpful way to get into Benjamin's writing. You can also, if you're just looking for Benjamin's work, then reading the theses on the philosophy of history is great, but they can be pretty opaque, or there's a lot packed into it if you don't have like this huge wealth of background knowledge. So the book Fire Alarm was super helpful for me to sort of begin unpacking that.
Hmm. Hmm. And do you think is oh well they want to know what
Oh, well, I wrote a dissertation, which is available if you want to dive into that. It's not published, but you can get it through the library, I guess, or I can share a copy. But
they can find you on the internet. Just
yeah,
start stalking
I am on the
Jeremy.
internet.
It is not hard to get someone to share their dissertation because uh every time you get like 20% more readers every time someone reads it.
Ooh.
You know, just because of
Right,
how few
true.
people read it.
Yeah.
You're like, I got my committee, my mom.
And
Yeah.
yep.
But yeah. So I mean, this has been fun. I appreciate those of you that have joined live, or if you're listening later as well. You can let me know what you think about this format. I enjoy doing it because it gives me a reason to hang out with friends and bring back up things we've talked about a bunch. Or if there's, a topic or thinker or something like that, you're like, oh, do the thesis and quote, discuss it with one of your friends thing. Feel free to recommend it. And yeah, any place you want to direct people to kind of find you, connect with you or whatever.
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at @Fackenthal. And if you just Google Jeremy Fackenthal, I'm the only one in the world, so that's pretty easy to find.
Not a hopping last name.
Nah.
All right. Well, you do it well. You do it well.
Thank you.